As a final example of the Leith effect, consider the golden calf. Most of us are familiar with the story of Moses, who brought the original 10 Commandments down from the mountain and found that in his absence the children of Israel had melted down their gold jewelry and made a golden calf which they were worshiping. Did you ever wonder why a golden calf? Why not a horse or a rabbit? The Bible never says, but if you know your Egyptian mythology, you will know that the Egyptians were sun worshippers, and one of their images was of the sacred cow that formed the four corners of the earth and sky. Every morning this cow gave birth to a golden calf, the sun. The Israelites were fresh out of Egypt and were reverting to the Egyptian religious practices. Why isn't this explained in the Bible? Because it was so well known it didn't have to be. This is fine for the time, but it wreaks havoc on future generations trying to discover what was going on. Think about the conversations you have every day. When you're talking with those within your culture, there's a great deal that goes unsaid, and in an oral culture, what is unsaid is unremembered, and so is lost forever. Let's turn now to the third principle, the distillation principle. It is very difficult in an oral society to remember complex stories. It happens, but it's relatively rare. What usually occurs as a story is passed down over the years is that the complex is made simple by distilling the story down to its essential components. There are two effects I want to mention here, the Delilah effect and the class action effect. The Delilah effect says that non-essential characters and stories are eventually lost. Most of you are probably familiar with the Bible story about Samson and Delilah. Samson was a strong man who was instrumental in helping the Israelites keep their enemy, the Philistines, at bay. He was seemingly unstoppable, but his wife Delilah eventually convinced him to give up the secret of his strength. It lay in his hair. If anyone was to cut off his hair, he would be as weak as a normal person. When I ask someone to tell what happened next, this is usually what is said. Delilah then cut off Samson's hair, rendering him weak, and he was taken captive by the Philistines. This is trivial, but it's a telling example of distillation, for a close reading of the story in the Old Testament reveals that Delilah didn't cut Samson's hair. She called in a servant who cut it. The servant is an unessential component of the story, and if the Hebrews had not written down the story with the servant in it, over time he would have been lost. A second example of distillation occurs with what is known as the class action effect, or the eponymous hero effect, in which entire tribes of people are sometimes reduced to a single person, usually rendered as a founder or a hero. A good example of this is the story of Cadmus, founder of the city of Thebes. Cadmus, having been promised a long line of descendants, was told by the oracle to found a city. The instructions were for him to follow a cow until the cow lay down, and that was where the city was to be founded. Now, cows aren't known for their geographic abilities, but Cadmus did as he was told, and eventually the cow lay down, and there he founded the city of Thebes. This makes for a good story, but it is entirely possible that it was not merely Cadmus who made this journey, but an entire tribe of nomadic wanderers who finally found a place to stay. But the masses of people in such a story are not essential. Since Cadmus is the focus of the story, the others may have been distilled out of existence. This may also be true of other hero stories. Instead of one person defeating a monster, such a story may be symbolic of the fact that one army with a great leader defeated another army. We have seen a few consequences of the fact that myth developed within an oral setting. There are many more aspects of orality that we don't have time to consider, but keep these few in mind as we study various myths. Let's move now to consider primitive logic. Here we will talk about 4 points: the narrative principle, the principle of perspective, the post hoc fallacy, and analogy. First, the narrative principle. Humans are storytellers. We naturally want to explain phenomena we see around us, and one of the timeless strategies for doing so is to make up a story. We have already seen an example of this in the story of Crater Lake. A volcano must have been a mysterious event for an ancient people, and so a narrative was built around the event that allowed it to be explained. There are a few important consequences of the narrative principle. First is what I call the kernel of truth principle. This reminds us, as we also saw with the oral principle of importance, that stories are never just that. Beneath the stories lies something important, something the stories were invented to explain. It is our job to discover this kernel of truth within the story. There is a related principle called the baby with the bathwater principle. This principle references the modern notion to dismiss myth as just stories. The mindset behind this is a disdain for ancient thinking, with the idea that there is nothing of interest within the stories of a primitive people. As you can guess, I think this is mistaken. The principle of perspective reminds us that chronological time is of little importance in most myth. The ancients had no reliable method for keeping track of historical events over long periods of time, and so various events became mixed together, all having happened back there somewhere in the mists of the past. For instance, if you ever try to figure out the age of the main characters involved in the Trojan War, you will see what I mean. Add to this that there were people like Nestor still alive at that time who had known Heracles, but none of this bothers the myth makers. Oral cultures live in a mysterious present, for the past is continually updated and then forgotten. For instance, in the 1800s, a British observer wrote down the oral history of one tribe in Nigeria. Generations later, when another observer studied the tribe, he found that substitutions had been made in the genealogies based on who the tribal leaders were at the time. The people were totally unaware that changes had been made. This is why chronological time is suspect in myth. The post hoc fallacy is the fallacy of thinking that just because B follows after A, B must have been caused by A. This fallacy is prevalent today and may be one of the fallacies most often committed by humans. For instance, when you catch a cold, don't you start wondering where you got it? And oftentimes you pin the cause on someone near you who had a cold before you. This is a version of the post hoc fallacy. I think it stems from the narrative principle, our desire to explain events in a narrative fashion even if we don't really know how. The post hoc fallacy is responsible for most superstitions in life. For example, you walk down the street, see a black cat, and then get hit by a car. Your mind automatically makes the connection to the black cat, and voila, a superstition is born. This is true of many other aspects of life as well. Good luck charms like the lucky shoes worn by a track star, or the rituals that tennis players go through before serving, exactly 3 bounces. The list is endless. You can see how this fallacy could easily promote mythological characters. You pray to Zeus to protect you from a lightning storm. No lightning strikes you, therefore Zeus protected you. That is post hoc reasoning.